In this PC beside me, we had a Ryzen 5 2600 installed in a previous video that we did, but now I've installed a Ryzen 3 2200G. Now this is a 4-core, 4-threaded option that comes in at $80 currently on the market. Great option for getting into PC gaming on a budget, but also on top of that, it's got a graphics portion built on board. So if you're on an extreme budget and you can't afford a GPU upgrade, you can use this reliably at 720p low settings and still get decent FPS. And all that for $80 makes it a good proposition. But what if you want to get a solid gaming graphics card like the RX 570 or the GTX 1650 and you want to get more performance than the Ryzen 3 2200G's APU option? Then is that CPU, those 4 cores brand new at $80, still worth it? Or is getting something like this right here beside me, a used OEM system with an i5-3470, 8GB of RAM, motherboard, cooler, and a Windows 10 license, better spent than getting the Ryzen 2 2200G? Well, today we're going to be testing out this i5-3470, which is pretty much 7 years old, I believe, and then putting that against AMD's budget 4-core option with the RX 570 and the GTX 1650 to see how much better the new counterpart fares against the used counterpart. If you're on the market for a Z390 motherboard and vocabulary isn't a word in your budget, then the Phantom Gaming 7 has you covered from ASRock with a superior updated aesthetic in 2019 with a pre-installed IO shield and RGB support with addressable and both 12-volt options and a 2.5 gigabit NIC on board, amazing onboard audio, and the ability to overclock a 9900K to Kingdom Come. This is the board that's going to please value lovers that aren't on a budget. Links in description below. Before we get on with the benchmarks and ultimately the verdict, however, I want to talk about what I believe is some misconceptions in the used market at the moment. Some people on the Discord like to rag on used price performance, but I think it's probably because they've got some new gear and they're so proud of their new parts and they just don't see the market appeal of used price per se. And me being an enthusiast of used price performance for years now, I know how good value for money this stuff really is, especially if you're getting some of those local deals. And some of the arguments that come through are like, okay, the new stuff has all support for the latest features, USB 3.2 and more PCIe lanes, PCIe 3.0, DDR4 memory. And honestly, a lot of that stuff, when you really break it down, is more geared towards things like 4K video editing, for example, or batch processing mass amounts of raw photographs, or making music, or doing a number of other things that don't involve gaming. I'd argue if you're a gamer and you're on a budget, used price performance is always the way to go, because the only productivity that I know personally in gaming is getting the most FPS. And if you're on a strict budget, then you're definitely going to get more FPS for your dollar on used price performance than you ever will in the new market. The second argument I see raised is used products are generally going to be more faultier than new products, and that depends. I'd argue if you go pick up the parts and you witness them working in action, I'd say there's a good chance that they're going to still work, especially when you investigate things like the caps and make sure they're not bulging, which is a big red flag in the used market. But if the caps are nice and they're looking good still, then that's a general indication that that product still has a good amount of life left in it. And also on that note, in the last 2 weeks here in the studio, I've had 2 faulty brand new hard drives, a faulty brand new DDR4 memory stick, and also a faulty brand new power supply. Now, of course, I do get the warranty, which is the advantage of new parts, but on that note, it's still a hassle for me to organize warranty, go get the product returned, replaced, and even then, I've got some downtime between now and when I get that product, the replaced one, back here in the studio. So new parts do carry their risks, just like used parts. The next argument in line is the security flaws and the risks they pose for certain people. Now, as an individual who plays video games and someone who recommends a lot of hardware to people who play video games on a budget, I'm gonna step out and say that I believe you have literally nothing to worry about in this sense. And that's because these security flaws, there's not one reported case of someone being affected by these security exploits. Second thing is as well is that the next round of exploits, apparently Intel's own in-house team found them themselves. And on that note, what better incentive to sell new CPUs than to say that the previous generations of CPUs that aren't getting any dedicated patches for them have security flaws. So basically go buy new CPUs because our old ones could leave your business and all their personal information at risk. seems a little bit too convenient. But the last point in relation to this subject is that if someone is that talented, like, I mean, they're on another level with their hacking skills, I do not believe they're going to target someone like you or I who only has a few dollars in the bank. They're going to be going for some much, and believe me when I say this, much bigger, juicier targets out there in terms of what monetary items and assets they have. And then the second last of the arguments to pull up here, and I believe is just like the instruction sets, probably a very valid one, is the upgradability. And after we roll the benchmarks, we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth. But the last argument is some of the instruction sets on the older CPUs, they just simply aren't there. And so the newer CPUs support these newer instruction sets like AVX2, for example, and those same instructions can then make their way into games. And if they're not there, then you can't either play the game or you'll get a bad experience in terms of FPS. It'll be stuttery, or you just won't get the FPS that you otherwise would on a new CPU. Now, we saw this in Apex Legends with really old CPUs. Pre-FX CPUs just simply didn't work. And that's pretty much where I've stopped featuring LGA 775. I've also haven't really used those old, really old Phenoms, for example, on the channel here. And the reason being is it's not just because they're really old, it's because they support DDR2. And a lot of the times I come into problems with the motherboards just having not been taken care of after all that time, and then they don't simply work properly. But for me personally, things like second, third, and fourth gen Intels, especially some of the OEMs, are really good value for money. Just promise me one thing, in this era, don't go buying a HP and then saying used price performance is bad. You can generally extract a lot of value out of Dells, Lenovo's, and Asus, and with that, you're getting the whole CPU, motherboard, RAM, and a genuine Windows license, and a lot of the time, getting a used hard drive that still works absolutely fine for less than the price of a brand new CPU. But with all that aside, let's get on with these benchmarks and then talk about the numbers. So after going through all those numbers for you guys, Apex Legends, the first game we pulled up, new title in 2019, but this title honestly didn't see any differences on either the GTX 1650 or the RX 570 across both Ryzen 3 2200G, Ryzen 5 2600, the i5-2620 V2, and also the i5-3470. Now, both the Intel CPUs are on Ivy Bridge, and of course, both the Ryzen CPUs are on Ryzen 2nd generation. But moving over to Dota 2, which is an older title, this was running on DirectX 9, which is what it defaults to now. And I have noticed in recent months that they had some problems on DX11 and boot issues. So I think they've defaulted to DX9 with this title. And it's interesting to see these numbers because the 4-cores pretty much battled it out in this title. The lower clocked Xeon didn't do as well. And then of course the Ryzen 5 2600 came ahead when we overclocked the memory speeds. Now the memory speeds did play a big factor in this game because it is pretty much single threaded dependent, and with that the higher RAM speeds will make a difference too, since I only clocked it manually to 3.8 gigahertz with the 3200 megahertz memory, and on the 4-core, believe it's only around 200 megahertz extra boost. So the RAM speeds were making a bit of a difference in this game. But on that note, the FPS on all 4 of these CPUs with these budget graphics cards is perfectly playable. If you're on a budget, you got a 60 FPS monitor, you're gonna get a smooth experience across all 4 of these CPUs. Now moving over to Hitman 2, DX12, this pretty much saw no difference across the board. It was nothing to write home about, the GTX 1650 losing to the RX 570 in this particular title. 1080p medium settings, and really smooth experience across all 4 CPUs. But now turning things back to CSGO, here we had the Ryzen 3 falling behind the Ryzen 5, and then the Ivy Bridge 4-core was beating out the 6-core, and it was pulling some decent FPS. So both the Ryzen 3 and the Ryzen 5 CPUs were pulling ahead of the Ivy Bridge CPUs in this benchmark. But one thing, if I do remember correctly, is it's not so much to do with the single-threaded speeds in this title, as I believe it has to do more so with memory speeds. It's something I'm going to be following up on, since we don't have the option on both of these Ivy Bridge CPUs to manually change the RAM speeds, so I couldn't test if that was a factor in this particular game. But I have known from experience with the X5650, for example, which is an older architecture, but has triple channel support, and I was able to overclock memory, that this CPU in particular has fared better than these 2 Ivy Bridge Xeons. And that's Westmere, which is 2 generations behind the CPUs from Intel in this video. But moving over to now to the next title, Resident Evil 2, and we had here nothing to write home about. Very smooth experience on all 4 CPUs across both graphics cards. Nothing out of the ordinary here, except the Intel CPUs were repeatedly doing just a little bit better than the Ryzen CPUs, even when the memory was overclocked on the Ryzen counterparts. Only a couple of percentage points, which in the grand scheme of things is absolutely nothing. And speaking of the grand scheme, here's where Dota 2 and CSGO showed quite a big difference for the higher clocked CPUs. The 6-core Xeon did fall behind by quite a bit in these 2 titles, though the other 3 titles we tested were absolutely fine. All the FPS figures were very close to one another. However, on the note of Dota 2 and CSGO, is playing with over 80 FPS in the case of Dota 2 and playing with over 120 FPS in CSGO a bad thing? I don't think so. I think if you're on a budget, these FPS figures are going to be absolutely fine for a good gaming experience. And in fact, if you went out and bought all 4 of these CPUs and coupled it with either of these 2 graphics cards, you're going to have a really good gaming experience. Of course, the Ryzen 5 2600 is going to do a lot better when you start coupling it with cards like the RTX 2070 and better, or the Vega 56 and better on the AMD side. So it just depends on your budget, but in terms of getting something like an RX 570 used for $80 and then coupling with an $18 CPU like the Xeon or an i5-3470 that you've pulled out of a used OEM, it's going to give you great performance. There's not a whole lot of reason, in my opinion, to go out and spend all that extra money on the new parts when you're not really going to be getting any extra FPS at all when it comes to these 2 graphics cards. But on that note, the new parts will have a much better upgrade path. If you get a B450 motherboard, you can upgrade the CPU in the future, sell your old CPU. But here's where I do have a bit of experience, and I've got friends here on the Gold Coast who flip PCs all the time. The amount of trade-ins we get versus people that come in and want to upgrade their system, or people that we know about at stores, retail stores, that come in getting parts wanting to upgrade their systems, is far less to the people who just want to trade in their old system, get a completely new system, and not have to think twice about that old system. But with that said, that's why I do believe in doing these budget builds on the channel, because you make that PC once, and then in a few years' time, just get rid of it and get the next latest and greatest thing out. Because in my opinion, by the time you're ready to upgrade your system in 2 or 3 years' time, there's going to be a lot of other components that are just either better or much cheaper. For instance, look at storage. It's come down a lot to the point where it's almost better to just go out and buy a whole SSD rather than an SSD and a hard drive. And new graphics architectures like Navi and also Intel's Arctic Sound are on the uptick, and they're going to bring some value for money in the new scene, which then of course trickles down to the used scene and makes the used price performance even better. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Let us know in the comment section below what you think of used price performance. But I know one thing for sure, and that is if you're an avid tech yes citizen, then you already know that used price performance is just unreal. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.